Hello, it's 2 o'clock. It's Tuesday, the 7th of April. I'm hiding away like yesterday in this little room upstairs in my house so that I don't get interrupted by the rest of my family, who are mostly in the garden anyway. I dare say some of you might be watching it later because at 2 o'clock, while I'm reading it, you're in the garden. If you've got a garden, or maybe you're out for a bike ride or out for a jog. Hope you're making the most of this amazing weather. I can't decide whether it's fantastic that the weather is amazing or a bit sad that the weather is amazing when we're all supposed to be staying indoors. But on balance, I've decided it's probably closer to fantastic because it would just be a whole lot more miserable, wouldn't it, if it was raining outside. So anyway, yeah, second to last, penultimate chapter of The Leopard in the Golden Cage. I realised that I hadn't shown you the website address for a few days because this was hidden away in my study, this little piece of paper with my mirror writing. It's mirror writing. My handwriting is usually a bit more competent than that. So if you want to find out more about the Roman period or the characters or the other books in the series, there's absolutely loads of stuff there. And there's quizzes. There's a quiz for each book. There's word search, there's a crossword, and yeah, there are various odds and ends, all sorts really, for each period. So there's a whole section for the Roman period, and there's a thing about Joe and Lucy and how to write a good story and other books I like and all that kind of thing. So do go along and take a look if you fancy. We are on chapter 15 today, 15 out of 16 of The Leopard in the Golden Cage, so I'm really glad that you stayed with me. That's just brilliant. I am probably going to go on and go on after I finish this book tomorrow. We'll finish this tomorrow, and then I'm going to go on with Saving the Unicorn's Horn, but I'm probably going to start doing it at 5 o'clock in the evening because I have realised that in terms of trying to get my own kids to do a bit of homeschool, 2 o'clock in the afternoon is a silly time. Because it's immediately after lunch, which would be a good time to do some drawing or junk modelling or something, I don't know quite what, baking maybe, or a bit of science. So yeah, 5 o'clock in the afternoon is when Save the Unicorn's Horn will start. Maybe on Thursday, I'll see how I feel really, because of course we've got the Easter weekend coming up. In the normal run of things, I wouldn't do this over the Easter weekend. But actually, of course, it's not really going to be any different for a lot of us. It's going to feel very much like the rest of the time. So I might just go on through. Anyway, I'll see. For now, we've got to chapter 15. So Joe has got himself back into Lucy's world. He couldn't find Lucy, if you remember. He's managed to pass himself off as a slave, although he's had to sort of slightly kind of blag his way through because he didn't have an apron. Fortunately, he remembered what slaves tend to be called. A lot of them are called privatus. Lucy told him that right at the beginning, and he remembered that, so at least he could come up with a plausible name. So he's now found her. She's in the sanatorium, which is where you would go if you were not well, the sanatorium. He doesn't really know what's the matter with her, except that he's heard from the little old man who keeps the storeroom that people have decided that she's ill because she's possessed by evil spirits. Okay, so Joe's gone into the room where Lucy is lying in bed, and she's opened her eyes, seen Joe, and burst into tears. Chapter 15. At the sound of Lucy's crying, the nurse came running. "What is it, Miss Lucilia?" The woman didn't sound at all sure of herself, Joe thought. In fact, she sounded nervous. He wondered why. He busied himself with stoking the fire, keeping his back turned towards them. "Is it the boy?" the nurse asked. "He'll be gone in a moment, or I can send him away now." No, Lucy wept. "I just don't feel very well. Could you bring me a decoction of lettuce?" "Of course, miss." The nurse rushed out at once. Joe shut the stove and stood up. That was an impressive show. He grinned at Lucy. "What's a decoction? Is it like a concoction? I don't think I fancy one made with lettuce." He pulled a face. but Lucy didn't stop crying. For a second or two, Joe stood watching her tears fall, not sure what to do. Then he put his arms awkwardly around her. "It's all right. I'm here now," he murmured. "I'm going to get you out of here somehow." Lucy sobbed against his arm. "I'm so glad you've come at last. Oh, Joe, it's been awful." "Are you ill?" "No, or at least I wasn't when they put me in here. I don't feel very well now, but that's because they hardly give me anything to eat." "How long have you been here?" "I don't know." She began to wail again. "It was the day after the feast, but I don't know how long ago that is. I lost count. It feels like forever." "And you haven't been out at all?" "No. They haven't even let me get out of bed except to use the pot. They never open the curtains, so I haven't seen the sky. I haven't seen my family. It's like being in prison." Her voice was getting higher and higher. "And the doctor makes me take this horrible medicine that burns my throat. I think they're trying to poison me." Joe stared. "Why are they doing all this if there's nothing wrong with you?" "They think I'm mad. Even the nurse is frightened of me. My father comes once every few days, just for 5 minutes, to see if I'm better." "But how can you prove to him you're better if there was nothing wrong in the first place?" "I don't know," she howled again. "I don't know what he wants me to say or do, but I'm so lonely and so bored. If I don't get out of here soon, I really will go mad." Joe squeezed her hand. "We'll think of something," he said, trying to be reassuring. "We've always come up with something before. You're so good at that." "Yes, and look where it's got me." Lucy wept bitter tears. Joe stroked her hair. She was right. Both times he'd disappeared, it was she who had been punished. "So what happened after I went?" he asked. "Did they catch the leopard? Was anyone hurt? Did the wedding go ahead? Did they find out I wasn't Valentinian?" Lucy waved a hand weakly. "Just hang on. Sorry, too many questions." She took a deep breath and struggled to sit up, but fell back against the pillows. Joe was shocked. She was so frail. There was no way he would be able to move her very far. Even if they could distract the nurse for long enough to get Lucy out of bed, it looked as though she would collapse before she got to the door. For a few seconds she lay motionless. Then she started to speak again very quietly. "The guards killed the leopard," she said, "but it had already attacked 2 of the guests. The woman died the same night. She had a huge gash in her neck, but I think the man survived." She paused. "Someone else was trampled to death in the panic as well." "That's terrible. So did someone deliberately let it out?" Lucy gave the faintest of shrugs. "Tiberius said it was you, and nobody would believe me when I said it wasn't, especially as you'd vanished by then. I don't know, maybe he did it." She was quiet for a moment, summoning her strength. Then, with a colossal effort, she managed to sit herself up. Joe tucked her pillows in behind her. "I don't think it was Tiberius," he said. "He couldn't wait for Marcus Placidius to speak to your father so that I would get found out." Lucy nodded. "You're probably right. As it was, he ended up having to wait quite a while for that." "Did the wedding still happen?" "No. At first they put it off. They thought it would be unlucky since 2 people had died and lots more had been hurt. And then the next day my uncle's family in Rome withdrew from the agreement. You remember they'd sent the leopard. It caused such disaster and humiliation for my father, they felt the only honourable thing to do was to back out." "So Sir Lucio escaped the horrible stepson?" Lucy smiled wanly. It was a good day for her in the end. Then her face fell. "Of course, they'll be looking for someone else. Unless they've done it while I've been in here. Nobody tells me anything." "When did your parents realise I was gone?" "It wasn't until the day after the feast, what with all the chaos. But then there was the Inquisition. My mother had spoken to Severina Orbiana, who of course wasn't ill at all, so they wanted to know who'd made up your story." How did they work out that it was you? Tiberius, Lucy said flatly. He guessed half of it and made up the rest, including the bit about you letting the leopard out. He made sure Septimus was punished too. Jo nodded. Arethusa told me about that. Lucy shuddered. She was the only part he didn't work out, thank heavens. There was a sound beyond the curtain. Quick, that's the nurse, Lucy whispered. You'll have to go. Can you bring me some food? She has a nap just after the midday meal. You can creep past her then. Jo bent and riddled the stove as the nurse entered. Still here? She gave him a look. It wasn't drawing very well, Jo muttered. It's fine now. I don't want to see you here again, she said sharply, unless you actually come with the governor. Very good, miss. Jo slipped past her and out of the room before she could comment on him calling her miss. He had no idea how he was supposed to address her. Outside again, he wondered what to do with himself until he could take food back to Lucy. He would have to carry on pretending to be a slave, but the more people he spoke to, the greater the risk would be of being noticed. He decided to go back to the room at the end of the south wing and see whether the earthenware pots were still there. He could carry those around the palace for a while at least. Before he'd gone more than a few steps, however, there was a shout behind him. Jo ignored it and hurried on. You, boy! He hesitated. Yes, you! He turned towards the voice. Lucy's eldest brother, Marius, was coming towards him. Have you just come from the sanatorium? Jo kept his eyes on the ground. Yes, sir, he mumbled in a deeper voice than usual. His heart thumped so loudly he felt sure Marius must be able to hear it. Is my sister still in there? Your sister? Jo looked carefully blank. Sallustia Lucilia, you half-wit, said Marius. Jo nodded. Yes, sir. And how is she? He thought for a moment. It was so annoying to be accused of being a half-wit, but he knew it would be a mistake to let his cover drop. I couldn't say, sir, he said instead. But you saw her, didn't you? Asked Marius, irritably. Yes, sir. Well, how did she look then? Jo clasped his hands together. There was no need to tell more lies than he had to. Thin, sir. Not very well. Marius shook his head. What's the matter with her? I don't know, sir. Jo saw out of the corner of his eye that Marius was looking away. He stole a glance at the older boy. I'd really like to see her, Lucy's brother said, more to himself than to Jo. Why don't you then? Jo bit his lip. He had slipped up and said what he was really thinking, and in his own voice too. But Marius seemed not to notice. My father would be furious, he said unhappily, and walked away. Jo breathed a sigh of relief. Thank goodness it had been Marius and not Petrus. Lucy's brother would have been certain to recognise him. He turned and hurried on. His best chance of not being stopped was to seem as busy as everyone else. Along the colonnades, people were still running to and fro, looking anxious. He should have asked Lucy what was happening, he thought. And then he realised, since she'd been in isolation for so long, she wouldn't know anyway. Suddenly, someone caught his arm. You, boy, what are you doing? Jo looked up at the woman. Her sleeves were rolled up and her arms were red. I'm fetching some pots from the end of the south wing, he said, as humbly as he could manage. Forget that, the woman barked. They need more pairs of hands to help with the accommodation. Jo nodded. You know where Helena Calvina's suite is? Yes, miss. Jo bowed his head, wishing again that he knew the correct way to speak to female slaves. Where did they find you? The woman chortled. Well, anyway, go straight there. It's to be rearranged for Domitia Longina. Domitia Longina? Jo repeated. The Emperor's wife, you nitwit. And the Emperor? He'll stay in the governor's suite of rooms. So where will the governor and Helena Calvina move to? To Jo's astonishment, the woman cuffed him across the back of the head. Too many questions, little big ears. Now go. She gave him a push towards the south wing. Joe trotted off obediently in the direction she'd sent him, but his stomach was churning again. So that was what all the running around was for. And of course, the Emperor was Domitian, the same Emperor who was going to have Lucy's father put to death. Joe's thoughts whirled around. Had he been called here to change the course of history? Was he supposed to do something to stop Domitian from killing Lucullus? Like what? Kill Domitian himself? He felt sick. Could he actually do that? In the meantime, he couldn't possibly go to Helena Calvina's rooms. If there was one person here who might know all of the slaves employed by the household, it would be her. And she, of all people, would be most likely to recognise him. As he reached the south wing, Joe looked back to see if the slave woman was watching him. But she'd gone. So instead of going through the nearest door, he continued along the colonnade towards the western end, still keeping his eyes down. Suddenly a pair of feet crossed his path. Joe stopped just in time to avoid crashing into their owner. "Look where you're going, you dirty little oaf," snarled a familiar voice. Joe froze. It was Tiberius. "Sorry, sir," he said, using the same deep voice he'd put on with Marius. He bowed low, bracing himself for Tiberius to strike him. That would still be better than being recognised. But Tiberius was gone already. "You'd better be," he snapped over his shoulder. Joe breathed again and hurried on. But something was niggling in his mind. There was something about Tiberius. He rubbed his forehead, trying to think. Then he realised Tiberius had been holding some kind of object in his hand, grasping it so tightly that his knuckles were white. Joe turned to see where he'd gone. It took a couple of seconds to spot him among all the slaves, but he was marching along the eastern colonnade. Joe's breath caught in his throat. It looked as though Tiberius might be going to the sanatorium. He hurried after him as quickly as he dared, afraid of drawing attention to himself. He couldn't risk being stopped again and sent on another errand. Outside the door of the sanatorium he paused. From inside he could hear the nurse's voice. "You can't just go in there. Nobody's to see her." "Hold your tongue, woman," Tiberius growled. "I'll do what I like." "We've been given strict instructions," the nurse shrieked. "Did you not hear me?" Joe could tell from Tiberius's voice that he'd bared his teeth. "Either you hold your tongue, or I'll make sure it gets held for you forever." There was a sound as though he'd lunged forward. The nurse squealed. "Do you understand?" hissed Tiberius. The woman whimpered. "Now stay there, and don't you dare call anyone." There was a swish as Tiberius flicked open the curtain in the doorway of the sick room. As quietly as possible, Joe crept into the outer room of the sanatorium. The nurse sat in her chair, gripping the arms of it with both hands as though she'd been tied up. She stared at Joe and opened her mouth, but made no sound. He pressed his finger hard against his lips. The nurse closed her mouth again. From Lucy's room he heard a cry. "No, Tiberius, no, I beg you." He crept forward. He would have only one chance against the bigger boy, and the only weapon he had was the element of surprise. Tiberius had his back to the open doorway. He was bending over the bed. "Don't worry, little Lucilia," he crooned. "I've sharpened it so that it won't hurt so much." "Why would you do this?" Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've never done anything to hurt you." "You haven't done anything to be favoured either, have you? Your father clearly doesn't think so, since he's locked you up in here." "I don't understand. If I'm locked up, how could I possibly be favoured?" Tiberius leaned closer. There are rumours that Domitia Longina is looking for a companion, a girl not yet of marriageable age. He cocked his head to one side. I agree, it's very unlikely that she would choose you, now that we know you're mad. But you must see you're the only girl who might do. Seleucia's too old and Antonia is too young. Why would you care? Because they'll only take one of us. But you're a boy. If she's looking for a girl, she wouldn't take you anyway. I know that, fool, but the Emperor might. Did you know, Tiberius said softly, that Domitian's only son died when he was 3? Had he lived, he would have been the same age as me. Joe's skin crawled. As it is, the Emperor has no heir for his dynasty. What makes you think he would take you? Just because your family doesn't want me, Tiberius snarled suddenly, it doesn't mean that nobody else does. The Emperor is a man without a son. I am a boy without a father. We could be a happy ending for each other. There was no pleasure in his voice. But only if they don't take you. And if I spoil your pretty face with a few cuts here and there, we can make sure they won't want to. He raised his fist. Lucy screamed. Joe leapt out from behind the curtain onto Tiberius's back. He grabbed his right arm and wrenched it away from Lucy. Tiberius shouted in surprise and writhed round. Joe clung on, still gripping Tiberius's arm. Tiberius stabbed desperately behind him. Joe felt a sharp pain in his thigh. He looked down. The iron shaft of a stylus stuck out of his flesh. Tiberius seized the end and twisted it. Joe yelled. He let go of Tiberius's arm and dug with his fingers into the older boy's eye sockets. Tiberius screeched. He dropped the stylus and clawed at Joe's hands. For a few seconds they wrestled together in wordless fury. Then Tiberius staggered. Together they fell, legs and arms entwined. The stone floor slammed against Joe's shoulder. His head cracked down. The room seemed to go dark. He blinked. Pain rushed in on him. All at once Tiberius let go. In the doorway stood Lucullus. Lucy's father may have come just in time, but actually it really depends how he sees Joe, what he thinks of Joe. This is the man who has locked his own daughter up because he thought she was mad, because she's been talking to evil spirits, and now he's confronted with the evil spirit, Joe himself. Incidentally, in case you're interested, a lot of what's in that last part about Domitian and Lucullus is true. So Domitian really did have Lucullus put to death, and the excuse given really was that he had invented a new lance and it had been named after him and not after Domitian. Domitian also did have a son who died when he was 3 and who would have been approximately the same age as Tiberius is in this book. So all of that is actually strictly true, although we don't know that Domitian ever visited Lucullus at Fishbourne Roman Palace. So yes, there we are. We've got the last chapter tomorrow, and 2 o'clock tomorrow, and then we'll go on after that with Saving the Unicorn's Horn, which, as some of you may know, is about Vikings. So we move from Romans and into Vikings, and we'll carry on after we finish The Leopard in the Golden Cage tomorrow. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you're interested in finding out more about the book, or the Roman times, or the characters, or what St. Christopher is, or anything like that, there's all sorts on this website, www.scargatherer.co.uk. And these videos are also now on YouTube as well, and they will be there. So if you're like me and you're a binge listener or a binge watcher, I always listen to all the radio programmes I like in huge batches. I don't listen to them as they come out. I listen to them all in one go afterwards. So if that's how you are, then you'll be able to listen to all of a book in one go once it's done. And each book takes about just over 3 weeks. Will take about just over 3 weeks to read. So yeah, I think we're going to motor on through, because we may as well, you know, to give you something to do, to give me something positive to do. I just wondered also, I noticed on the screen that I can see, I wondered if you could identify the books that are behind me. The top row are pretty obvious, just from the colours of the covers and the relative thicknesses, so you'll probably know what those are. I wonder if you can identify any of the ones in the next row. So there are two, there's one on the end, the black one with the gold text, and then there are two different series there. I don't know whether you can read the titles. You probably can't, and in fact they'll be in mirror writing anyway, but I just wondered whether you could work them out. Anyway, so I'll see you tomorrow for the final instalment of The Leopard in the Golden Cage, and I hope you have a nice afternoon and evening. Bye!